Last year's conference made headlines with talk of mass resignations, industrial action in response to the crisis facing general practice. 12 months on, has the mood here changed?
I think the profession a year on is looking at ways to address the problems. What last year did was highlight, expose the unsustainability of general practice, and that's what we achieved last year. We're now entering an election where all the political parties are putting general practice as a firm proposal to support and invest in. So we've achieved the recognition that the future is not sustainable unless the pressures on general practice and the investment that it needs is addressed.
In your speech at conference this morning, you said that despite the GP forward view, NHS England's acceptance of elements of the urgent prescription proposed by GPC, measures in the new contract, despite that, general practice remains on the brink of collapse, you said. Some GPs here say GPC should have done more to get more from the government, or you should have gone ahead with those plans for industrial action or ballots for mass resignation. How do you respond to those?
Okay, well, I mean, the first thing is remember general practice is part of an overall NHS and public sector spend. So we have a government that refused to listen to its own NHS England chief executive when he asked for more money. We have a government that turned a blind eye to the Health Select Committee writing a letter, a government that's ignored all authoritative opinion from the King's Fund to the Nuffield Trust. So one has to recognise that this is a government that's just not been listening. So within that reality that there was no mention of funding for the NHS in the autumn statement, for example. So when you're actually dealing with such intransigence, I think the profession recognises that there is a limit to what we can do as GPC, because what you really need is a collective public demand that the NHS is resourced properly. We also know that there's no value in us trying to get money out of an NHS that is totally broke. There is no point in trying to destabilise our community nurses and get more money into general practice. There is no resources in other parts of the system. So I think that what we have done is make use of, and what we've set out to do, is to make sure that all the committed resources that NHS England put forward needed to be delivered as they announced, and make sure that that money is not squandered. Now, we're only a year into a 5-year programme with the forward view, and it's not enough because the NHS funding is not enough. That's the problem. And therefore, critically, until we sort out NHS funding and make sure it's adequate, we're not going to solve the problems of general practice and the NHS.
You said this morning that the solution is a political one, that the next government must increase NHS funding. From what we've seen so far of the election campaign, do you think that's going to happen?
I think the public will force the issue, because the government can't, no government in the future will be able to hide behind the pretense of words. I think the public have now become wise. They're not going to be sold lies. They know the situation, that it takes a long time to see a GP. They know that we're struggling. They can see practices closing. They can see the fact that GPs can't recruit, so they can't see the same individual on several occasions. They know the reality of hospital pressures. So I think that any politician that pretends that you can carry on running an NHS with the promises that they're coming out with, or they will come out with, without the addressing the fact that we need more money, will not work. You basically can't run the NHS at £10 billion shorter than the money available in other parts of Europe, and get away with it. I don't think the public will accept that. So it will be forced as a political decision, in my view.
And you've said that GPs must demand a government that properly funds the NHS. How should GPs go about that? What should they be doing?
Sure. I mean, GPs see probably 90% of the population in a year. We also know that our patients highly value us and trust us. And I think that therefore GPs have enormous potential to argue the case, not for themselves, but for patient care being provided with dignity, with enough time, with kindness. All of those things are not possible when you're working under the pressures that we're currently working under. And also, more importantly, for safety. So you have any government that will be elected will, I'm sure, be committed to safety in the NHS. And you can't do that if more than 8 in 10 GPs say they cannot provide safe, quality care. So GPs do have it, and if it can be coordinated in the right way, I believe we can raise the demand on any government. It's not just this election, but it's a government that comes into power to be to really hold them to account and stop the political pretense that we've seen in recent years of promising one thing to the population but delivering something far short of that.
During this election campaign, should GPs be talking to their patients in their practices even about the issues that general practice face and how that relates to the election and politics?
You know, I think even without having to formally talk about it, patients are in conversation with their GPs. They realise and they see the harsh realities. We've tried very hard to advise GPs, to make it clear, and we've tried to do that in our national work, that when patients are waiting too long to see a GP, that's not the GP's fault, it's because there aren't enough of us. When they're actually given too little time, it's because there are too few GPs trying to cram in too many patients. Now, we've got that message out to the public. It's now well embedded in the media, on television, on online, on radio, and the public and patients, I believe, get that. So what we need to do is capitalize on that awareness and make sure that when we do have a new government, unless the government comes out with language that addresses that reality, that the public, the patients, need to demand what the NHS needs.
Final point, lots of talk this morning and later on for the next couple of days, I'm sure, about working at scale, better collaboration at the grassroots among GPs. How important is that for the future of the service?
I think that it's critical that as a profession we survive the current situation, because what I believe has to happen is that the next government is going to need to address NHS funding, but what you don't want is to see general practice collapse before that time comes. So working at scale is just a set of words. What I'm referring to is the ability for GP practices to support each other, to work with each other, recognizing that today's secure practice could be tomorrow's vulnerable practice. And we've seen this in the past happen in the 90s when I was a young GP, when practices worked together, clubbed together to enable us to actually provide what seems today an impossibility, which was 24-hour responsibility. So having seen that, grown up throughout that culture, I believe this is the time to resurrect that. Even without creating new structures, there is the ability within the current contract, informally for practices, to share staff, to cover for each other, to create shared management approaches, therefore reduce costs, and really make sure that we're there pulling for each other to keep general practice afloat. And I say afloat, so this is very much a survival strategy. It's not the definitive solution. The definitive solution is for general practice to be resourced properly. But until that time, I believe that a way forward, and GPC believes a way forward, is for practices to pull together, supporting each other through collaborative structures. And this isn't theory, because up and down the country, these models are appearing. They're being generated by practices themselves. We've come across models where we know that practices would have closed had it not been for GPs creating these collaborative structures. We've seen situations where practices have been unable to recruit, where working within a pooled arrangement, there's been support for such practices. What I believe needs to happen is that the government, or NHS England, need to make sure that the GP Forward View transformation monies, the £3 per head that they've said will be available, is actually going to support practices to work with and support each other for sustainability. That's what needs to happen.